Welcome to Medieval History Channel 97, where the echoes of the past come alive. Step into the world of knights, castles, and forgotten legends as we journey through time together. Let history speak. Hello, before we embark on our journey back through the corridors of time, I want to take a quiet moment to warmly greet you, wherever you are in the world and whatever hour it may be. Whether morning's light is just breaking, the afternoon sun is high, or the evening has wrapped you in its calm, I'm truly grateful that you've chosen to join us tonight for this gentle voyage through the lives and eras of our ancestors. If you don't mind, I'd love to know where exactly you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Please feel free to share in the comments below. There's something deeply humbling and beautiful about seeing the many corners of the world that come together here, united by curiosity and a shared love for history. If you find comfort in these calm, immersive stories that blend education with peaceful reflection, I invite you to subscribe so you won't miss future adventures into the past. But for now, settle in, make yourself comfortable, and allow me to gently carry you away to a very different time and place. Tonight, we will explore what life was truly like for women in medieval Europe, a world spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th century AD. It was a time of knights and towering castles, devastating plagues and fierce crusades, magnificent cathedrals reaching toward the heavens, and vast estates sprawling across the land. A time of immense change, deep upheaval, yet bound tightly by ancient traditions and rigid social orders. For most women, the everyday reality of medieval life was far from the romanticized tales of chivalry, courtly love, or fairy tale princesses that often color our modern imaginations. The truth was often harsh, restrictive, and unforgiving. Women had few rights, little freedom, and even less control over their own destinies. From birth to death, most lived under the shadow of men, first their fathers, then their husbands, with very limited opportunity to shape their own paths. Of course, experiences varied somewhat by social standing and circumstance. A wealthy noblewoman's life was worlds apart from that of a poor peasant girl. Yet across the board, women faced many of the same fundamental challenges deeply woven into the cultural fabric and customs of the time. Over the hours ahead, we'll dive deeply into many aspects of medieval womanhood, tracing the journey from childhood through adolescence, marriage, motherhood, and into old age. We'll explore their daily routines and duties, their roles within family and society, the hardships and health struggles they endured, and the strict moral codes that govern their behavior. I will share with you intimate stories of real medieval women who left their mark on history, queens and commoners, nuns and noble ladies, healers and accused heretics, each offering a unique perspective that enriches our understanding of this complex era. But before we fully immerse ourselves in the distant past, let us first set the scene. Imagine, if you will, a world lit only by fire. A world where every flicker of flame was not just a source of light, but a fragile beacon against the darkness. In this world, life itself followed the relentless cadence of the sun, rising with its first gentle rays and retreating with its final glow. It was a world carved by extremes, the lavish splendor of towering castles for the privileged few, and the crushing weight of poverty for the countless souls trapped beneath. Picture the landscape. A mosaic of massive stone fortresses standing guard like silent sentinels over the rolling fields. Nearby, humble thatched cottages huddled close to the manor house, their chimneys whispering smoke into the cold air. Farther still, the soaring spires of a grand cathedral pierced the heavens, their bells tolling solemnly, marking the sacred hours that shaped every moment of daily life. The air was thick with the scent of burning wood, freshly baked bread, and the earthy musk of farm animals. A relentless symphony surrounded the people. The sharp barks of dogs, the bleating of sheep, the steady ring of hammers and axes from the blacksmith and woodcutter. From dawn's first light to dusk's last shadow, people labored ceaselessly, their backs bent and spirits tested by the unyielding struggle just to survive. Into this unforgiving world, a medieval girl was born. From the very first breath she drew, the odds were cruelly stacked against her. A reality so harsh that in our modern world, blessed with advanced medicine, technology, and ideals of human rights and equality, it is nearly impossible to fully grasp. To face this truth is humbling. It forces us to confront how mercilessly different life was for the women who came before us, how their existence was shaped by forces beyond their control. So as we journey back tonight, stepping softly into their worn shoes, we must hold tightly to one essential understanding. We cannot judge their world through our 21st century eyes alone. We must set aside our modern prejudices, our assumptions about what life should be, and instead open ourselves to truly listen to their stories. By doing so, we awaken a deeper awareness, a recognition not only of how far humanity has traveled on the path toward gender equality, but also of how much remains to be done. And so, without hesitation, let us begin at the fragile beginning of a medieval woman's life. In the Middle Ages, childhood was a fragile and fleeting gift, especially for girls. The harsh reality was heartbreakingly clear. 30 to 50% of children would never reach their 5th birthday. Infant mortality was a shadow that hovered over every cradle, a silent thief stealing potential futures in the night. Countless young lives were claimed by accidents, hunger, and disease. Invisible enemies that offered no mercy. For those few who survived beyond infancy, the concept of childhood as a time of wonder, play, and learning was almost non-existent. Instead, childhood was a brief and uncertain passage, overshadowed by the weight of survival and the demands of an unforgiving world. In these harsh conditions, the medieval girl's journey was marked not by freedom, but by a constant, quiet fight. A fight for breath, for life, for a place in a world that seemed designed to deny her both. Children were viewed as miniature adults, with little special regard for their developmental needs and vulnerabilities. As soon as they were old enough to walk and talk, kids were expected to contribute to the family economy in whatever way they could manage, often assisting their parents with daily chores and labor. Imagine the weight placed on those small shoulders. Children thrust prematurely into the harsh realities of survival, their innocence rapidly fading as they learn to carry burdens far beyond their years. Childhood was not a sanctuary of play and wonder, but rather a brief, rigorous apprenticeship for adulthood, a relentless training ground where critical skills were forged and the transition to mature roles demanded without pause. For girls, this meant focusing almost exclusively on domestic matters with little opportunity for formal education. Unlike some of their male peers who might attend a parish school or receive tutoring from a learned cleric, most girls' schooling took place strictly within the home. From the very first moments of awareness, girls were gently yet firmly molded into the confines of their expected futures. Their lives were circumscribed by modesty, obedience, and submission. These were not merely traits to aspire to, but imperatives drilled into their hearts alongside the practical skills of homemaking, cooking, sewing, spinning wool, and caring for the children and the sick. The walls of their homes became classrooms where lessons were learned not through textbooks, but through quiet observation and silent imitation under the watchful eyes of mothers, grandmothers, and older sisters. Biblical stories and religious instruction also played a key role in a young girl's moral upbringing, cementing her subservient position in the God-ordained hierarchy of the sexes. While some noble women might be taught to read and write, this was the exception rather than the rule. For the average peasant girl, formal learning was a distant dream, a rare luxury almost never realized. Female literacy hovered around a staggering low of 5%. Even among the upper classes, education for girls was never about intellectual growth or empowerment. It was merely a preparation for their predetermined destiny, to become wives and mothers. Indeed, the end of childhood often came abruptly and decisively with the onset of puberty and marriage. In the Middle Ages, marriage was less about love or personal fulfillment than it was a practical arrangement designed to strengthen family alliances, increase economic stability, and produce the next generation. One can only feel the sharp sting of loss that must have accompanied this abrupt transformation. A young girl barely stepping into adolescence, suddenly uprooted and handed over to a future unknown, dictated by family interests rather than her own dreams or desires. The concept of choice was foreign. Decisions were made for her, usually by fathers or male relatives, with the bride's voice barely a whisper in the process. Legally, the minimum age for marriage was 12 for girls and 14 for boys, though betrothals and negotiations might begin much earlier. In practice, however, most women married in their late teens to early 20s, especially among the peasantry, where girls were vital sources of domestic labor for their birth families. Still, it wasn't entirely uncommon for very young girls, particularly in noble and royal circles, to be married off to much older men for political or financial gain. Think of the fragile heart of a sheltered adolescent girl, barely understanding the complexities of adulthood, suddenly torn from the familiarity of her family and thrust into the cold unknown of a stranger's household. The terror, the loneliness, the silent fears held tightly behind composed faces. These emotions lived quietly, yet powerfully, in the shadows of history. One poignant example of such a child bride was Isabeau of Bavaria, who at age 15 was wed to King Charles VI of France, a man 16 years her senior. A renowned beauty plucked from the minor nobility, Isabel was born into a political alliance between France and Bavaria, a union where her own feelings barely mattered, swept aside like a fragile leaf caught in the fierce currents of power and expectation. Thrust into a world where alliances outweighed affection, she found herself trapped in the strange, gilded cage of royal duty. In the glittering, often cold and unforgiving world of the French court, the young queen stood woefully unprepared, her heart heavy with an invisible burden. The weight of expectation pressed down relentlessly on her shoulders. Chief among them, the demand to produce a male heir, a precious symbol of continuity for the royal bloodline. This was not merely a hope, but a fierce, consuming obligation that would come to define the next chapter of her life. A relentless journey as a wife and mother, whose worth would be measured not by her dreams, but by the children she bore. From the vantage point of our modern sensibilities, it's almost impossible to fully grasp the brutal physical and emotional toll endured by these young brides of the medieval era. Torn abruptly from the familiar embrace of their childhood and thrust into an alien existence, many must have felt heartbreakingly isolated, stripped of their own identity and thrust into roles they had no say in choosing. The loneliness, the fear, the pressure to adapt and survive must have carved deep scars into their spirits, often hidden beneath the glittering veneer of courtly life. Their weddings, far from the romanticized ceremonies we envision today, were stark affairs. No delicate lace veils or flowing white gowns to soften the reality, just a simple exchange of vows before witnesses, sometimes officiated by a priest, sealing contracts more than love. For common folk, such simplicity sufficed. For the nobility, even the grander celebrations served mostly as displays of political power, binding families and kingdoms rather than hearts. The bride was a prize handed over from the authority of one man to another, her identity swallowed by that of her husband. In many cases, marriage meant a definitive, painful severing of ties with her birth family. Unlike peasant brides who often remained near their parents, these noble women were expected to leave the warmth of their childhood homes to enter the cold and complex world of their husband's household. There, they faced the daunting challenge of mastering a new domestic hierarchy, learning delicate social navigation to carve out a place for themselves amid their in-laws, who might regard them as outsiders or rivals. For a young woman still learning the responsibilities of running a household, the pressure to blend seamlessly into this unfamiliar environment must have been suffocating. Yet, beyond all these challenges, the gravest responsibility, and the one that carried the highest risk, was the expectation that she would bear children swiftly and repeatedly. In an age when medical knowledge was scant and mortality rates soared, pregnancy and childbirth were perilous journeys, fraught with danger and uncertainty. Each birth could be a matter of life or death, yet the relentless demand for heirs allowed no room for rest or mourning. Join me next time as we delve deeper into the joys and profound sorrows of medieval motherhood, the crushing pressure to produce heirs, the harsh judgment cast upon women who bore daughters instead of sons, and the heartbreaking losses endured across every level of society. We will meet Eleanor of Castile, one of the era's most compelling maternal figures, and follow her tumultuous reproductive history, spanning decades of queenship filled with both hope and grief. Until then, I hope you'll take a moment to reflect on the little girls of the Middle Ages, the would-be brides and mothers whose childhoods ended almost before they began. Try to imagine yourself in their embroidered slippers, facing an uncertain future in an unforgiving world. Pause for a moment and let yourself feel the weight of their reality. These young souls, barely tasting the sweetness of youth, were thrust prematurely into roles dictated by others, roles that demanded sacrifice, silence, and obedience. Their dreams, fragile as gossamer, were overshadowed by a looming destiny that offered little mercy. The delicate embroidery on their slippers might have masked trembling feet, uncertain steps toward a life they did not choose. Sleep well, and know that when next we meet, we'll once more shine a light into history's hidden corners and give voice to the often voiceless women who lived there. For theirs is a story that deserves to be told, no matter how distant or difficult it may be. Thank you. As always, thank you for spending this time with me. Sweet dreams, and I'll see you soon for another boring bedtime story plucked from the pages of our collective past. Until then, farewell. As we've seen, medieval women were subject to intense oppression and restriction in virtually every area of life, from birth to death. Their existences were tightly controlled by the men around them. Fathers, husbands, brothers, priests. A woman had little autonomy over her own body, mind, or destiny. She was always under the watchful eye of male authority figures, quick to punish any perceived transgressions. Imagine the constant pressure, the suffocating gaze that stripped away individuality and agency. To live with the knowledge that any misstep, real or imagined, could bring humiliation, pain, or worse. A life where fear of punishment overshadowed the hope for freedom. The harsh morality of the Middle Ages, rooted in religious doctrine, placed women in an impossible bind. On one hand, church teachings cast women as inherently sinful and morally weak, daughters of temptress Eve. Their beauty was seen as a threat, a tool for leading men astray. Women were expected to cover their hair and dress modestly to avoid inflaming male lust, at the same time as wives. Mothers and women's primary duty was to be obedient, chaste, and pure. Any hint of flirtatiousness or sexual impropriety could ruin a woman's reputation. Adultery, even if committed by a husband, was always seen as the wife's failure. A jealous or disgruntled husband could easily accuse his wife of infidelity, condemning her to punishment. Picture the terror of knowing that your reputation, your very existence, could be shattered by a single accusation, often wielded as a weapon by those who claimed to love or control you. The injustice was raw, the cruelty systemic. Those punishments for accused adulteresses were brutal and humiliating. A woman might be paraded through the streets, stripped to the waist, while a town crier announced her sins. She could be whipped, dunked in water, or locked in the stocks while crowds jeered and threw rotten food. In extreme cases, the penalty was death. Feel the sting of shame imposed not just by the physical torment, but by the collective scorn of society, a scorn that branded a woman publicly, stripping away dignity and hope. These acts were meant to break her spirit, to silence her, to serve as a grim warning to others. A woman did not even need to commit a crime to become the target of public humiliation. Simple acts like gossiping, scolding, or nagging were enough to invite harsh, painful embarrassment. Imagine the cold, unyielding weight of the scold's bridle, an iron contraption that enclosed a woman's head, pressing a metal bit down on her tongue to silence her. The accused woman would be paraded through the town, exposed to relentless mockery and shame, stripped of dignity before the eyes of all. For those rare women who sought refuge in religious life, freedom was still heartbreakingly out of reach. Nuns lived lives of severe austerity, their days bound tightly to relentless prayer schedules, their bodies hidden beneath shapeless habits that erased their individuality. Silence was demanded. A nun was to be seen, but never heard, a muted presence in a world that denied her voice. Yet some women took this extreme even further. They willingly locked themselves away for life as anchoresses, enclosed in tiny stone cells attached to churches with nothing but a narrow window through which food and sacraments passed. Most would never leave again, choosing this grim and lonely fate in the hope of spiritual solace. Among them, one of the most renowned was Julian of Norwich, an English mystic. Stricken by severe illness as a young woman, she was granted a series of divine visions that changed her life forever. After recovering, Julian withdrew from the world entirely, retreating into permanent seclusion for decades in her cramped anchor hold. There, enveloped by solitude, she poured her soul into prayer and meditation, capturing her mystical insights in Revelations of Divine Love, believed to be the very first book written in English by a woman. In her confinement, Julian found a unique form of spiritual freedom, a sanctuary from the harsh realities that most women endured. Outside Julian's cell, however, the world was unforgiving. Medieval women labored under backbreaking burdens, their existence a waking nightmare by today's standards. Domestic violence was tragically accepted as a husband's right to correct his wife, a brutal reality that crushed countless lives in silence. The harrowing story of Margarita Flanders reveals deep vulnerabilities even of noble women. As the daughter of King Louis II, she was destined for a shining dynastic marriage, but instead she was abducted repeatedly by her cruel husband, Davos. Imprisoned and tormented, Marguerite bore his many children, but lived under a shadow of relentless abuse. When she finally fled to her father, seeking refuge, her suffering was far from over. The king initially sided with her, but Davos' cold legal argument that a wife was essentially her husband's property forced Marguerite back into the cage of her abuser's cruelty until his death. This tragic fate far too common. Women, regardless of birth or status, were treated as little more than chattel, objects to be owned, traded, and discarded. Without family protection or wealth, the common woman was utterly vulnerable, her worth measured only by the whims of the men who controlled her life. A rural woman might break her back doing farm labor from dawn to dusk or injure herself hauling water and firewood. Her exhausted body would be expected to produce a brood of children, always hoping for sons. If she managed to survive the dangers of childbirth, she had to contend with near starvation as food was scarce and malnutrition common. Imagine the weight of this relentless toil, each day bleeding into the next with no rest. Her muscles aching, skin sunburnt and cracked, yet the demands never cease. The hope for sons, not just children, reveals a harsh truth. Her value was measured not in her own humanity, but in the lives she could bear for others. Repetitive stress would age her prematurely. Disease and poor hygiene ravaged her health. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs were constant companions. She was old before her time. Her spirit, worn thin like the tattered fabric of her clothes, bore silent witness to the cruelty of a life that allowed no gentleness, no reprieve. The insects that feasted on her body were reminders of a world that overlooked her pain, indifferent to her suffering. For unmarried women, survival often meant resorting to begging or prostitution. Unattached females were viewed with deep suspicion by medieval society. Women were expected to be under the dominion of a man, either a husband or a male relative. Without that protection and control, they were seen as dangerous and unnatural. This stark reality forced many into impossible choices. Stripped of social safety nets, unmarried women faced isolation, mistrust, and judgment, as if their very independence was a threat to the fragile order of their world. Their survival was a daily struggle against scorn and invisibility. Those who sold their bodies to scrape by lived on the margins in every sense. Prostitutes were simultaneously necessary and reviled. Cities like London had designated red light districts such as Soduk, where brothels could operate under license. But the woman caught plying her trade outside those boundaries faced severe fines and time in the stocks. Living life on such a precarious edge, these women bore the burden of survival with a fierce resilience, even as society shunned them. Their existence was a paradox, both needed and condemned, protected by law only so long as they stayed within rigid confines. As bad as their situation was, prostitutes still fared better than other desperate women. Those who sank into vagrancy or joined wandering bands of criminals risked brutal treatment at the hands of the law. Medieval justice was swift and merciless. Women could be flogged, branded, or subjected to mutilation for crimes as petty as theft. The brutal hand of justice was less about fairness and more about control, a warning etched in flesh and blood to keep women in their places. The fear of such cruelty haunted every shadowed corner of a woman's life, eroding hope and silencing cries for mercy. But all women, whether princess or prostitute, lived in the shadow of an even darker threat. The specter of violence against women loomed large, an inescapable hazard. Men of all classes, from nobles to peasants, saw the women around them as fair game to be used and abused. The The notion of consent was virtually non-existent, only if the victim was an unmarried virgin, ideally of good family, were her claims taken seriously. Even then, the best she could hope for was that her attacker might be pressured into marrying her. After all, he had ruined her, so it was the least he could do to make her his wife. The woman's feelings in the matter were irrelevant. Her trauma was dismissed, overshadowed by a cold calculation of honor and property. The crushing weight of a society that commodified her very body left her voiceless, trapped between violation and forced union. Perhaps nothing illustrates the precarious position of medieval women as much as the fear of witchcraft accusations that hung over their heads like the sword of Damocles. In a world where bad harvests or sickness striking down cattle could threaten a community's very survival, women were convenient scapegoats. Any woman who stood out, whether for her knowledge of her lore or her failure to conform, could find herself denounced. The fear was not just of the unknown, but of the power a woman might hold. Power that unsettled the rigid structures around her. Knowledge, independence, or even simple difference could mark her for destruction. Midwives and female healers were especially vulnerable, targeted for their dark arts. A woman who eased the pains of childbirth or nursed villages through disease was just as easily painted as a consort of the devil. If crops failed or babies fell ill, she was blamed for wielding evil magic. The healing hands that soothed agony became symbols of suspicion and fear. The very gifts that could save lives were twisted into evidence of malevolent forces, tearing communities apart through paranoia and cruelty. Witch trials were sham affairs, with the outcome decided from the start. Accused women were stripped and searched for the devil's mark, some blemish or mole that supposedly proved their guilt. Confessions were extracted under torture, and not confessing was also seen as proof. So the innocent were damned either way. The injustice was total, no room for truth, mercy, or reason. Women stood defenseless before a system that sought to break their bodies and spirits alike, condemning them to death or exile on the thinnest of pretenses. The lucky ones were spared the worst, only dunked in water or subjected to public humiliation. But for many accused witches, their fate was far more brutal. A fiery death at the stake, consumed by flames before a jeering mob. The raw, searing misogyny of these witch trials wasn't just cruelty. It was a fierce warning etched into the lives of all medieval women. They lived perpetually on a razor's edge, where one misstep, one misunderstood word, could spell death. In the suffocating grip of constant oppression and looming threats of male violence, it feels almost miraculous that medieval women could carve out even the smallest fragments of agency and self-determination. Yet in this dark landscape, some remarkable women dared to resist. They rebelled quietly, powerfully, against the rigid roles forced upon them by men and society. Christine de Pizan stands as a shining beacon from this era, a pioneer among female writers who boldly challenged the rampant misogyny poisoning male-dominated scholarly works. Her groundbreaking book, The Book of the City of Ladies, gathers stories of extraordinary women and directly confronts the hateful arguments leveled against them. As a widow writing to sustain her family, she faced sneers and dismissals from male intellectuals, yet she pressed on with fierce passion. Her powerful call for women's moral and intellectual equality was centuries ahead of its time, sowing the seeds of what would grow into feminism. But it wasn't only great figures who fought back. In the everyday lives of countless women, quiet acts of resilience and sisterhood flourished. In the birthing rooms, women leaned on one another, sharing strength and solace. Networks of care emerged, where children were looked after by many hands. In the fields, amidst the backbreaking labor, they exchanged whispers, complaints, and moments of laughter, brief sparks of joy in a world otherwise filled with hardship. Mothers, aware of the harsh realities their daughters would face, taught them survival skills, how to manage a household, how to navigate the treacherous terrain of marriage. They armed the next generation with the tools to endure, to persist, and sometimes to quietly resist. Yes, the portrait of medieval womanhood is grim, a world of endless toil, suffering, and enforced submission. But it's vital to remember that women were never mere passive victims. Wherever possible, in ways big and small, they claimed power, they asserted agency, and they refused to be erased. Through it all, their grit, grace, and resilience shone like a steady flame amid the darkness. As we close this chapter on the harsh realities of medieval women's lives, it's worth pausing to reflect on how far we have come. The idea that women are property, disposable at a man's whim, is rightly condemned. Though accusations of witchcraft may still arise in some parts of the world, no longer do we see women burned alive for crimes they did not commit. Yet, even as we celebrate progress, we must stay vigilant. The forms of injustice and oppression may have evolved, but the struggle for true equality and freedom remains unfinished. The fight endures, calling us all to remember, resist, and keep pushing forward. Medieval misogyny may seem like a distant relic, yet its haunting echoes still ripple through the fabric of our modern world. It's a shadow cast long and deep, one that whispers reminders of a time when women's voices were stifled, their bodies controlled, and their spirits confined. As you drift off to sleep tonight, pause for a moment to honor the extraordinary strength and unyielding courage of the women who came before us. They bore the unbearable, silent, steadfast, and resolute, enduring hardships so profound that it seems almost impossible to fathom. Yet in their endurance, they forged a path for future generations, laying down bricks of resilience and hope. We stand today on the shoulders of these medieval women whose sacrifices echo through time, urging us to keep moving forward. We owe it to their memory, to their legacy, to strive relentlessly for a world where every woman can live with dignity, safety, and freedom. The road ahead stretches long and uncertain, but as Christine Dizon so eloquently observed, women have been left defenseless for so long that some men believe it must remain that way. Brick by brick, however, we dismantle that outdated belief, building a new reality, one shaped by justice, respect, and empowerment. Though medieval women lived in an era cloaked in darkness, their indomitable spirits shone brightly, like flickering candles piercing the night, guiding us on toward a better tomorrow. That, my friends, is not just dusty history. It is a sacred story worth remembering as you close your eyes tonight. Sweet dreams. Life in medieval times was harsh for everyone, but for women, the struggles were uniquely relentless. The poor hygiene and sanitation made managing the monthly cycle a trial of endurance. Without modern menstrual products, women relied on homemade cloth pads or rags, washed and reused endlessly. These provided little comfort, little protection. Some resorted to stuffing grass, hay, sheep's wool, or even moss into their garments, trying to stave off discomfort and embarrassment. It's easy to imagine the chafing, the infections, the constant ache beneath the surface. Bathing, a simple act we take for granted today, was a rare luxury then, especially for women of lower classes. Even access to rivers or streams often meant exposure to polluted waters, contaminated by human and animal waste, carrying illness rather than cleansing it away. Fearful that water could invade the body's pores and bring sickness, most bathed infrequently, perhaps only a few times a year, relying on quick sponge baths. The ever-present lice and fleas were unwelcome companions, adding to the daily hardships. Laundry was another endless toil. Clothing was washed laboriously by hand in boiling pots or rushing rivers, scrubbed fiercely against washboards, then wrung out and hung to dry. The wet, heavy fabric near fires posed burn risks, and with only 1 or 2 sets of clothing per family, garments were worn threadbare, making each wash a necessary but exhausting battle. Even in the castles and manor houses of the nobility, where standards were somewhat better, the comforts of modern hygiene were absent. Wealthy women had servants to heat water, prepare baths, and launder clothes regularly, and scented oils and herbs masked odors. Yet, grand stone fortresses lacked running water, flush toilets, and proper waste disposal. Chamber pots were emptied out windows onto courtyards, a reminder that even privilege could not escape the era's harsh realities. This glimpse into medieval women's lives reveals not just struggle, but the fierce resilience they embodied. Their stories are not distant folklore, but a testament to the strength, dignity, and spirit that continue to inspire us today. As you reflect on their journey, may it awaken gratitude for how far we've come and determination for the road still ahead. One of the most unusual and precious wedding gifts an aristocratic medieval bride could receive was a flea fur, a fur wrap meant to attract fleas away from the body. This small but vital token reveals a harsh truth. Pests were inescapable. Rats scurried relentlessly through bedchambers and banquet halls, spreading fleas that carried the deadly bubonic plague. Imagine the constant dread lurking beneath the surface of even the grandest celebrations, a shadow of sickness and death that no wealth could keep at bay. When the Black Death swept mercilessly through Europe in the 14th century, it erased an unimaginable 60% of the population. Women stood courageously on the front lines, nursing the sick with tender hands and mourning the relentless loss of loved ones. The plague tore society apart, fracturing old certainties and accelerating shifts in medieval medicine. In this crucible of suffering, the resilience and compassion of women shone through, though their sacrifices were often unspoken and unseen. Tending to the ill became a sacred duty that largely fell on women, wives, mothers, midwives, and nuns who cared for the dying when physicians were few, distant, and costly. Their work was essential, yet rarely acknowledged, with the honor it deserved. Convents, too, became fragile sanctuaries, serving as hospitals of last resort for the poor and desperate. Elderly nuns, guardians of ancient knowledge, passed down herbal folk remedies to novices, weaving together the wisdom of generations into fragile hope. Some women transformed this knowledge into lifelines, becoming midwives, apothecaries, and even surgeons, navigating a world that often refused to recognize their skills. One remarkable figure was Jacqueline Felicia d'Almania in 14th century Paris. Despite being put on trial by the University of Paris's medical faculty simply for being a woman practicing medicine, her patients, priests and noblewomen alike, defended her fiercely. They praised her diagnostic acumen and treatment skills that outshone many male physicians. Yet, despite this, she was excommunicated and barred from continuing her healing work. Such was the brutal reality. The rare woman who dared enter the male-dominated field of medicine risked not only rejection, but persecution. More often, a woman's home remedies were dismissed as witchcraft or superstition. To deviate from the Church's rigid doctrine was to invite the terrifying label of heretic or witch. The fear of female knowledge and independence permeated every corner of medieval life. Midwives were especially vulnerable, cast as sorceresses if a childbirth ended tragically. A woman with knowledge of plants to ease pain or end pregnancy was accused of consorting with the devil. The wise woman, once respected as a healer, might find herself reviled and hunted in old age. Inquisitors interrogated and tortured countless women, forcing confessions through unbearable cruelty. Once accused, a woman's fate was almost sealed. Innocence was nearly impossible to prove, particularly for those unmarried or elderly women without male protectors. Over 80% of the estimated 50,000 to 100,000 victims executed for witchcraft between 1500 and 1660 were women. These witch hunts and burnings embodied the crushing grip of medieval patriarchy, a desperate need to control, silence, and punish any woman who dared to defy the tightly woven cultural norms. Even a woman who strove to embody the ideal wife, mother, and Christian remained stained by Eve's original sin, forever seen as weak-willed, flawed, and dangerously susceptible to temptation. Her world was one of submission and service, confined to the domestic realm where her worth was measured by her obedience and her ability to bear children. To step beyond these boundaries was to invite not only male scrutiny but the ruin of her reputation. An unmarried woman was branded a liability, her very existence a threat because she could not fulfill the sole purpose assigned to her, producing heirs. A married woman was little more than her husband's property, to be protected or punished as he saw fit, with no regard for her feelings, desires, or dignity. In these shadows of history, we glimpse the profound courage of women who lived, loved, and healed despite relentless oppression. Their stories echo still, reminding us how far we've come and how much their quiet strength continues to inspire. With so much of a woman's worth bound tightly to her ability to bear children, the weight of expectation pressed heavily on her shoulders. Pregnancy was a paradox of hope and dread, each new life carrying the promise of continuation, yet shadowed by the ever-present spirit of death in childbirth. For noble women, success was measured by producing at least one male heir who survived infancy. Queens who failed to deliver a prince risked being cast aside, replaced by a more fertile consort. The grim fate that befell many of Henry VIII's wives serves as a haunting reminder of this cruel reality. For peasant women, the dangers of pregnancy and childbirth were even more acute. Deprived of proper nutrition, clean living conditions, and adequate medical care, many suffered from malnutrition that led to rickets, a vitamin D deficiency that warped their pelvises and made labor agonizingly difficult and perilous. The act of bringing a child into the world was often a prolonged ordeal, stretching over days, even a week, marked by relentless sweat, blood, and unbearable pain. When labor seemed endless, a midwife might urge the mother to use the sacred birthing girdle of the Virgin Mary, a relic kept in the local parish treasury, placing it gently on the mother's stomach in the desperate hope it would hasten delivery. Yet, this relic offered little tangible aid. Midwives did all they could to ease suffering with herbal tinctures and soothing salves, but their greatest hope was simply to catch the newborn and save the mother's life. Farda Izab's tragic plight was far from unique. For girls born into noble families, the day of marriage often arrived long before their 18th birthday. Political alliances and the strengthening of family bonds took precedence over a young bride's readiness or personal choice, binding them to lives dictated by duty rather than desire. Though a privileged queen, Isabeau still faced many of the same heart-wrenching challenges that weighed down women of lesser means in medieval times, especially when it came to marriage and motherhood. The pressure to produce a male heir was not just a duty, but an unbearable burden pressing heavily on her shoulders. A woman's worth was cruelly measured by her fertility and the number of sons she could bring into the world who survived infancy. To fail in delivering a boy was to invite shame and scorn, an agony even queens could not escape. Childbirth itself was a harrowing ordeal, a dance with death in an age where medical knowledge was crude at best. Each pregnancy was a perilous journey, a leap into the unknown where a woman quite literally risked her life. Take Queen Eleanina of Castile, wife of Edward I of England, who endured an astonishing 16 pregnancies over 28 long years in the late 13th century. Though many of her children did not survive, she herself endured, a testament to the remarkable strength and resilience medieval women summoned in the face of unimaginable adversity. For the vast majority, commoners, not queens, daily life was a relentless grind of endless chores and back-breaking labor from the moment the sun rose until it sank beneath the horizon. If a woman wasn't cooking, cleaning, sewing, or tending to her children, she was likely shoulder to shoulder with her husband, toiling in the fields, fetching water from distant wells, or gathering firewood in the forest. The weight of survival rested heavily on her every movement. Privacy was a luxury nearly unheard of for average medieval families. Most homes were cramped, claustrophobic spaces where every member ate, slept, and lived in suffocating proximity. Beds were often shared out of sheer necessity, an everyday reality that could breed tension, frustration, and conflict between couples or parents and children, where space was a scarce treasure and tempers a volatile currency. Hygiene, by modern standards, was severely lacking. Fleas, lice, and other pests were constant companions, invading bodies and homes alike. Chamber pots sat within easy reach, but waste was often discarded carelessly into the streets, turning towns and cities into breeding grounds for disease and despair. It's no wonder that sickness and plague ran rampant, claiming countless lives in the squalid conditions of medieval life. In this world, every breath was fragile, every day a struggle, and every woman, whether queen or commoner, carried the invisible scars of these harsh realities. But perhaps no aspect of a woman's life was as trying and tragic as the lack of control over her own destiny. The concept of personal freedom and self-determination as we know it today simply did not exist for the vast majority of women in the Middle Ages. From cradle to grave, a woman's path was dictated by the men in her life: fathers, husbands, brothers, sons. Even a woman of considerable talents and intellect was hard-pressed to forge an independent existence. Imagine the suffocating weight of having your entire life mapped out by others, your dreams and choices shackled by invisible chains of expectation and control, the soul's quiet yearning for autonomy, crushed beneath the relentless grip of patriarchal authority. Such was the reality for most medieval women, brilliant minds and gifted hearts trapped within a world that denied them agency. The French writer Christine de Pizan stands out as a rare exception. After losing her husband at a young age, de Pizan defied convention by supporting herself and her children as a professional scribe and author. In her most famous work, The Book of the City of Ladies, she imagined an allegorical city populated by great women of history and mythology. It was a revolutionary act of the imagination in a time when the prevailing wisdom held that women were weak, fickle creatures, incapable of reason or virtue. But de Pizan's proto-feminist thinking was centuries ahead of its time. Her courage to write and imagine a world where women's worth was recognized was a beacon of light amid the shadows of oppression, a testament to the indomitable spirit that refused to be silenced. For most medieval women, their bodies were not fully their own. They were at the mercy of their husbands' desires and whims, subject to physical and sexual abuse with little recourse. Marital rape was not a concept, as a woman was considered her husband's property. Domestic violence was a husband's prerogative. The violation of bodily autonomy, the terror of violence hidden behind closed doors, these were silent horrors that countless women endured, their suffering invisible and dismissed. The home, meant to be a sanctuary, was often a prison ruled by fear. If a beaten wife dared to complain, she was more likely to be chastised for provoking his anger than to see justice served. Even a highborn woman had little protection against an abusive spouse. When Marguerite, the Countess of Flanders, displeased her cruel husband Louis of Maille, he had her abducted, imprisoned, and threatened with execution. Her story reads like a Gothic nightmare, yet it was all too real, a grim reminder of how even noble blood could not shield a woman from brutality. The echoes of her suffering reverberate through history, giving voice to the many whose pain was never recorded. In the 14th century, her story reads like a Gothic nightmare, but it was all too real for countless medieval women. The Church, which permeated every aspect of medieval society, often reinforced oppressive attitudes toward women. Ever since Eve tempted Adam with the forbidden fruit, women had been seen as inherently sinful, morally suspect seductresses who led men astray. Bound by these ancient narratives, women were condemned to bear the weight of blame and suspicion, their humanity diminished by doctrines that cast them as temptresses and sinners. The harsh judgment of a patriarchal faith deepened the wounds of gender inequality, shaping a world where women struggled to reclaim their dignity and voice. Female sexuality was something to be stifled and strictly controlled, a fragile flame to be either extinguished or locked away behind iron bars of social expectation. A woman's foremost duty was clear and merciless, to remain chaste and pure, ideally as a virgin consecrated to Christ. If that was not her path, then she was expected to embody the image of the virtuous wife and devoted mother, her worth measured by obedience and submission. Woe betide any woman who dared to step beyond those narrow, unforgiving lines of acceptable behavior. The consequences were harsh and unrelenting. Ruined reputations that followed like shadows, abandonment by family and community, brutal physical punishment, or even death in the most extreme and merciless cases. Amid such suffocating constraints, some women sought refuge by turning inward, retreating into religious seclusion as a desperate means of escape from a world that seemed to offer no mercy. Julian of Norwich, the English mystic of the early 15th century, chose to be walled up alive in a tiny cell attached to a church. Through a small window, she received her meager sustenance, while outside the world moved on without her. For decades, she lived in solitude, prayer, and contemplation, producing extraordinary revelations that continue to inspire. For Julian, the cell was both sanctuary and spiritual purpose, a place to cultivate inner freedom amid physical confinement. But from a modern perspective, it resembles little more than solitary imprisonment, a stark symbol of the crushing limitations imposed on medieval women. Their lives were defined by constriction, constricted opportunity, constricted bodies, constricted spirits, corseted by rigid gender roles and cloaked in the heavy fabric of religious doctrine. Most endured immense hardship and faced untimely deaths, their struggles largely invisible to history. Yet, even in such darkness, women found ways to assert their agency, to carve out spaces of resistance and resilience. Through grit and grace, through fury and faith, through tears and toil, they persevered. Each act of courage and quiet defiance chipped away at the walls of oppression. The centuries have brought hard-won freedoms, yet the specter of misogyny that haunted the Middle Ages still lingers, its shadows stretching into our present day. We continue to wrestle with many of the same issues. unequal treatment, the policing of women's bodies, gender-based violence, and systemic discrimination. In learning about the trials and tenacity of our foremothers, we deepen our appreciation for their strength and recognize how far we still must travel. As we honor the women of the distant past, we pay tribute to their sacrifices and their indomitable spirit, a beacon of resilience shining across time, inspiring us to keep striving for justice and equality. We owe it to them to keep striving for a world in which a woman's worth is measured not by the sons she bears or the home she keeps, but by the force of her intellect, the depth of her compassion, the fire of her conviction, and the greatness of her soul. The gloom and chill of a typical medieval peasant dwelling is difficult for us to fathom today, accustomed as we are to modern comforts and conveniences. Imagine, if you will, a 1 or 2 room hovel. The walls were erected from wooden stakes interwoven with sticks and packed with a crude mixture of mud, straw, and manure. The floor was simply hard-packed dirt, trodden by the feet of generations. If the family was slightly better off, they might enjoy the relative luxury of a few rough-hewn wooden planks laid across the earthen floor. But there would be little respite from the damp and the cold, seeping up from the ground, chilling one to the bone. The thatched roof overhead might keep out the worst of the rain, but it was a constant battle to patch the leaks and keep vermin at bay. In one corner of this dismal abode, a medieval woman crouched over the hearth, stoking the smoky fire. Soot stained her face and homespun woolen dress. Her red, chapped hands expertly wielded a cast-iron pot stirring a watery pottage, the mainstay of a peasant family's diet. Into the bubbling liquid went whatever meager vegetables could be spared from the harvest, along with a precious scrap or two of salted pork on a feast day, if they were lucky. This was the domain of the medieval housewife, a dim, suffocating world bounded by the bare earthen walls of the cottage and the muddy trackways of the village beyond. From dawn to dusk, her life revolved around an unceasing round of toil, feeding the fire, hauling water, cooking, spinning, sewing, washing, scrubbing, and tending to the needs of her husband and children. A woman's work was never done, as the old saying goes, and nowhere was this truer than in the Middle Ages. While her husband labored in the fields or perhaps plied a trade as a blacksmith or carpenter in the village, a woman's place was firmly in the home. Her role was to be the subservient caretaker, with little thought given to her own needs, desires, or ambitions. Now, imagine the heaviness of that existence, the endless, exhausting labor under harsh conditions. Picture the ache in her hands from daily chores, the weariness in her eyes that no rest could fully soothe. Her life confined within these crude walls, the weight of expectation pressing down like the cold damp seeping through the floor. Yet, within this bleakness, there was resilience. Each stirring of the pot, every stitch sewn, each trip to fetch water was an act of steadfast love and survival. Her spirit endured quietly, a silent force holding together the fragile fabric of family and home. To recognize this woman's worth is to honor a legacy of strength born from hardship, a strength that deserves to be remembered and celebrated beyond the boundaries of history's shadows. A woman's tools of survival were few and unadorned. A couple of heavy cast-iron pots, worn wooden bowls and utensils, a rough stone quern for grinding grain into flour, and the humble spindle and distaff for spinning wool into thread. With such sparse implements, she was tasked with conjuring domestic miracles, transforming meager provisions into nourishment and clothing to sustain her family. Yet, even as her hands moved rhythmically, stirring the thick pottage or kneading the dense black bread, the humble staple of the medieval peasant diet, her mind could wander beyond the smoke-filled kitchen. The village priest's Sunday sermon echoed in her thoughts, recounting the story of the Virgin Mary, that ultimate emblem of feminine virtue who bore the Savior himself. Could there be, she wondered, a higher meaning to her life than ceaseless toil and drudgery? But such dangerous sparks of hope were quickly snuffed out. For a medieval woman, salvation was found not in dreams or ambition, but in humble submission to her husband and unwavering devotion to God. To reach beyond these bounds invited suspicion, accusations of pride, stubborn willfulness, or the darkest fear of all, witchcraft. No, it was far safer to keep one's head bowed, preserve one's virtue, and pray silently for a better existence in the life beyond. For in this mortal world, A woman's fate was one of relentless hardship and service, a life carefully policed by society's harshest judgments. Woe to any woman who dared to question her place or step beyond the narrow path carved for her. Yet amidst this grim reality, some dared to dream differently. Christine d'Izan was one such woman, a spark of brilliance born in Venice in 1364. Her father, a renowned physician and astrologer, held a prestigious position at the court of King Charles V of France. Raised in the rarefied intellectual glow of the royal court, young Christine was afforded an education few medieval girls could imagine. She learned to read and write in Latin and French, studied the great classics of literature and philosophy, and had privileged access to the king's vast and magnificent library, a treasure trove of knowledge beyond the reach of most women of her era. Her father, progressive in his beliefs, nurtured her inquisitive mind and encouraged her scholarly pursuits with steadfast support. Yet at the tender age of 15, Christine's fate was sealed by the demands of her time. She was married off to a nobleman named Etienne d'Astel, her personal dreams subsumed by the tides of social expectation. It was an arranged match, as was typical for the time. But by all accounts, the couple grew to love and respect one another deeply. Christine bore 3 children and settled into the expected role of a beautiful wife and mother. Yet beneath this surface of domestic calm, Christine's heart carried both hope and hidden strength. The gentle rhythms of family life offered moments of joy, but the shadows of uncertainty always lingered nearby. But Christine's domestic tranquility was not to last. In the space of a few short years, she lost her beloved husband to an outbreak of plague, followed by her father's death soon after. At the age of 25, Christine found herself a widow and an orphan, left alone to fend for herself and her young children in a world that had little use for an educated woman without a man's protection. Imagine the depth of grief crushing her soul, the ache of loss compounded by the harsh reality of survival. Alone and vulnerable, Christine stood at the edge of an uncertain future, forced to navigate a society that denied her worth without the shield of a man. Facing financial ruin and the loss of her cherished library, Christine made a courageous and virtually unprecedented decision. She would support her family through her writing, becoming one of Europe's first professional female authors. This was no small feat, an act of defiance and resilience in a world that told her to be silent and invisible. With trembling hands yet unwavering resolve, she embraced her pen as a lifeline, forging a path not just for herself, but for countless women yet to come. With quill and ink, Christine carved out a place for herself in the almost exclusively male domain of medieval literature. She began by writing love ballads and devotional poetry, genres deemed suitably feminine and unthreatening. But as her confidence and reputation grew, Christine turned her mind to weightier matters. Her words blossomed from delicate songs to bold proclamations, echoing through the halls of history. She refused to be confined by society's narrow expectations, daring instead to speak truth and challenge prejudice. In her most famous work, The Book of the City of Ladies, she crafted an impassioned defense of women against the misogynistic attitudes of her time. With elegant, incisive prose, Christine dismantled the pervasive notion that women were inherently morally and intellectually inferior to men. Through her writing, she built a sanctuary where women's voices could rise, fierce and proud, reclaiming dignity denied to them for centuries. Her book was more than literature. It was a declaration of worth, a beacon of hope. She argued that women were just as capable of virtue, learning, and leadership as their male counterparts, if only they were given the chance to prove themselves. This was a radical truth, a call to awaken the sleeping potential within every woman shackled by ignorance and oppression. Christine's courage invited society to reconsider, to see women not as shadows but as equals. Through a series of vivid biographical sketches, Christine celebrated the accomplishments of great female scholars, artists, warriors, and saints throughout history, from the ancient world to her own time. Each story was a tribute, a reminder that greatness transcends gender, that women have always been architects of culture, strength, and spirit. Christine's work illuminated a lineage of resilience and brilliance, inspiring generations to rise beyond the confines imposed upon them. She illuminated the lives of women who defied staggering odds to leave an indelible mark on history. Among them was Hypatia of Alexandria, the brilliant scholar whose pursuit of philosophy and mathematics led to her brutal murder by a mob intolerant of her intellect and independence. There was the formidable Queen Semiramis of Assyria, a masterful military strategist who expanded her empire with unwavering resolve. And then the saintly mystic Hildegard of Bingen, whose divine visions and transcendent music echoed throughout Christendom, inspiring awe and devotion. With each tale, Christine de Pizan dismantled the towering walls of misogyny, making an unassailable argument for the equal worth of women and men. Her radical ideas found a home among a small but growing circle of educated women who saw in Christine a beacon, an emblem of hope in a world bent on keeping them unseen and unheard. Yet, Christine's revolutionary views did not sit well with the male powers of her time. She bore the sting of harsh criticism and the scorn of ridicule, dismissed by some as a shrill harpy or a deluded madwoman. Her lifelong struggle for recognition and respect mirrored the deep-rooted obstacles that medieval women with ambitions beyond hearth and home were forced to confront. But Christine refused to be silenced. She wrote tirelessly until her death around 1430, leaving behind a legacy of words that would inspire countless generations of women. Her voice, raised defiantly against oppression, continues to resonate across the centuries, a testament to the power of one woman's courage. As we explore the stories of medieval women, keep Christine de Pizan close to heart, a rare flicker of light amid pervasive darkness. For most women of her era, the dream of intellectual independence was a distant, often unattainable hope. Marguerite's story reveals the precariousness even noble women endured. Despite her wealth and status, she remained trapped under the control of men, treated as property to be bartered and controlled. The near-total absence of consequences for her husband's audacious abduction underscores how acts of gendered violence and oppression were tolerated, even normalized. A woman's safety and well-being were seldom, if ever, a priority. And for women of lower classes, life was even harsher. Without wealth or social standing to protect them, peasant women were vulnerable, exploited by lords, masters, and even their own kin. Domestic abuse was widespread, not recognized as wrongdoing, but accepted as a man's authority to discipline his wife and daughters. This stark reality of medieval womanhood reveals a world shaped by power imbalances and systemic cruelty, but also one where courage and resistance quietly endured. According to church doctrine, a woman's role was defined with brutal clarity, to obey and submit without question. If she dared to step out of line, violence was not only tolerated, but considered an acceptable means of discipline. This harsh reality shaped the lives of countless women who were expected to endure suffering silently, their pain dismissed as a necessary part of their duty. Worse still, the law offered women almost no protection. In most of medieval Europe, a woman could not press charges against an abuser, seek separation, or pursue justice on her own behalf. The world around her turned a blind eye as domestic matters were deemed private and beyond public interference. Unless abuse became so egregious that it sparked a public scandal, women were left to bear their torment in solitude. To leave a marriage was to risk utter social ruin, a fate that threatened not just a woman's safety but her very existence in society. Only in the most extreme cases, often involving noble women, might a desperate appeal to family or church be considered. Yet such pleas frequently fell on deaf ears. A wife was seen as her husband's property, to be controlled and disciplined within the walls of their home. It was all too common for a battered wife to be returned to her abuser after a brief respite, unless her family had the means to quietly place her in a convent, a rare refuge amid bleak options. The precarious vulnerability of women's position in this era can be starkly seen in one of the Middle Ages' most infamous cases, that of Margarita of Flanders. Born in 1350 as the only daughter of Louis II, Count of Flanders, Margarita was the sole heir to a vast and wealthy territory, making her a prized possession in the medieval marriage market. At the tender age of 11, she was wed to Philip of Roufs, Duke of Burgundy, only to become a young widow at 15 after his early death. Her father swiftly arranged a new political marriage, this time to Philip the Bold, also of Burgundy. But the true battle for control of her fortune was just beginning. Her own cousin, Louis III, Count of Flanders, refused to stand aside. Driven by ambition to keep Flanders within the family, Louis brazenly abducted Margarita, spiriting her away to Ghent against her will. The young woman, caught between men fighting over power and wealth, had almost no agency in her own life. Though her father eventually recovered her and annulled the original betrothal to Philip, the whole sordid affair revealed a painful truth. Even women of the highest status were pawns in the ruthless power struggles of men, their lives and bodies used as currency in a game they could barely influence. This grim reality underscores the deep-seated injustices women faced, trapped within a system designed to control and silence them. Such casual misogyny and oppression seeped into all aspects of a medieval woman's life, even the spiritual. The teachings of the Catholic Church in this period were heavily imbued with notions of female subservience, sinfulness, and sexual temptation. Ever since Eve took a bite of that forbidden fruit, women were seen as morally weaker and more prone to vice than men. Imagine carrying such a burden for centuries, being defined by an ancient story as inherently flawed, eternally suspect, and forever cast into the shadows of blame. As descendants of Eve, women were considered inherently more lustful, vain, emotionally unsteady. They were seen as intellectually deficient. These supposed flaws became the justification for their subordination to cool, rational men tasked with controlling women's behavior for their own good and for the stability of society. The weight of this imposed inferiority crushed countless dreams, silenced voices, and confined women to narrow roles where their worth was measured solely by obedience and silence. The Church preached that virtuous women were obedient, chaste, modest, quiet, and diligently domestic, always working in service of their fathers, brothers, and husbands. Any deviation from this pious feminine ideal was swiftly condemned. Women who dared to speak out, defy expectations, or aspire beyond their limited roles were branded unnatural and dangerous. Their ambition was a threat to the social order that relied on their submission. And yet the cruelest ironies lay in the harshest judgments of women's sexuality. Those who engaged in unsanctioned sexual behavior, whether sex, outside marriage, adultery, or prostitution, were painted as wicked temptresses, leading men into sin. Never mind that it was usually men coercing and exploiting women into such compromising situations in the first place. Women bore the full weight of shame and punishment for acts often forced upon them. So it's no surprise that one of the worst labels a woman could attract was that of a witch. The medieval church saw witchcraft as the ultimate expression of feminine evil. A woman enthralled to the devil, wielding supernatural powers to subvert male authority and corrupt the innocent. This fear of female power, knowledge, and autonomy bred a deadly paranoia. Who were the women accused? Often they were society's vulnerable, widows living alone, unmarried older women, midwives, herbalists, beggars. Those who did not fit into the prescribed roles of demure wife and mother. These women became scapegoats for any misfortune that befell a community, from failed crops and sickness to impotence and disaster. The smallest, most flimsy evidence was enough to condemn them. The horrors they endured defy comprehension: torture, forced confessions, and brutal executions by burning at the stake, hanging, or drowning. Their lives were extinguished in flames kindled by fear and misogyny, a grim reminder of how deeply fear of women's power could poison a society. The notorious witch hunts of the early modern period did not emerge out of nowhere. Their roots lay deeply embedded in the medieval church's profound suspicion and vilification of unchecked female power. Yet paradoxically, most women of the time were anything but powerful. Whether a noble lady draped in finery or a humble peasant cloaked in toil, women lived lives tightly confined, their freedom and agency curtailed at every turn by the men who ruled over them. In response to such limitations, many women turned inward, seeking refuge in prayer. Religion offered one of the few spaces where women might claim a fragment of autonomy and a voice for self-expression, though always within the strict boundaries imposed by doctrine and hierarchy. For some, becoming a nun presented a rare alternative to the prescribed path of marriage. It offered an opportunity to pursue a life devoted to the mind and spirit, shielded from the relentless demands of male authority. Female mystics, too, were cautiously tolerated, sometimes even revered, so long as their spiritual revelations stayed within acceptable theological limits. One remarkable example was Julian of Norwich, an English anchoress who embraced a radical monastic existence. In her 30s, she asked to be permanently enclosed or anchored in a small cell adjoining a church, dedicating the remainder of her life to solitary prayer and contemplation. The door to her cell was ceremonially sealed, a symbolic death to the outside world, with the understanding that she would never walk through it again. When she eventually died, her body was taken out through a small high window facing the church's interior, a poignant testament to her complete withdrawal from worldly life. For decades, Julian remained in this stone chamber by scarcely longer than 15 paces, receiving food and necessities only through a tiny opening. Yet, despite such profound isolation and deprivation, this life was, for some women, preferable to the constraints of marriage. As an anchoress, Julian owed allegiance to no man but Christ alone. Freed from domestic burdens and childbearing, she could devote herself wholly to her spiritual practice, a rare and radical form of female autonomy in a world governed by patriarchal rule. Through her high window, she became more than a silent prisoner. She was a beacon, a counselor to the parishioners who sought her prayers and wisdom. In this rare role, she wielded a quiet influence and authority that medieval society seldom granted to women. Her mystical visions, captured in her remarkable book, Revelations of Divine Love, boldly portrayed God in feminine terms, a nurturing mother, a radical and tender reimagining that challenged the very foundations of her time. For a woman to put forth her own theological interpretations was nothing short of revolutionary. That her writings survived centuries of skepticism and censorship is a testament to the profound respect she earned within her community. Yet Julian's unconventional life was marked by profound deprivation and confinement. Like all medieval women, she lived at the mercy of a patriarchal church and society that saw female bodies and minds as threats to be controlled and contained. Whether trapped in a loveless marriage, confined within the cold stone walls of a drafty castle, or walled into a monastic cell, women had scant control over their destinies. Their existence was a series of forced choices and roads left unexplored, a life where talents were silenced and dreams stifled. Submission, silence, survival, these were the unyielding demands placed upon them. Medieval women may not have framed their suffering in terms of equality or justice, but they lived the slow suffocation of those constraints every day, a tightening cage around their possibilities. And yet, through the suffocating darkness, they endured. They found slivers of light where they could, in their children, their craftsmanship, their faith. They took pride in what was theirs to hold, however small, and they carried their families and communities on weary shoulders. In doing so, these women laid the very foundations for the freedoms that later generations would fight to claim. Their sacrifices, their indomitable strength, their quiet resilience were the roots from which future blossoms of liberation would grow. So tonight, as we drift off to sleep, let us honor these forgotten lives. Let us imagine the worlds they might have lived in, a world that cherished them fully, freely, and without fear. And let us carry their stories forward, aware both of how far we've come and how far we still must go. For in the end, women's history is human history, our liberation forever intertwined. With that, I bid you good night. Rest well, dear listener, and dream of kinder times. Marguerite's harrowing tale starkly illustrates the fragile and precarious position even noble women held in medieval society. At the whims of men, their choices were often erased. Consent mattered little. A woman, especially a wife, was regarded as property, a possession to be claimed and exploited. This brutal disregard for women's bodily autonomy was not isolated, but pervasive across every level of medieval society. Domestic violence was rampant, with husbands entitled to physically chastise their wives as they saw fit. As the 15th century Liber Extra decreed, a man may chastise his wife and beat her for her own correction, for she belongs to him, so may he chastise her. Picture the brutal reality for countless women trapped in this cycle of violence. The sting of blows, the silent tears, the daily terror behind closed doors where love was twisted into control and pain. Peasant women often bore the brunt of their husbands' frustrations over grueling field labor, meager food, and wretched living conditions. With large families crammed into tiny cottages, privacy was non-existent, and tempers were short. The wine and ale consumed to stave off hunger and contaminated water, certainly didn't help matters. The harshness of their world compounded the suffering. Exhaustion and desperation feeding a vicious spiral where anger and violence found cruel outlets in the most vulnerable. Higher up the social ladder, aristocratic husbands might exercise a bit more restraint with their beatings to avoid marring their wives' appearances. However, spousal abuse remained common, if more discreet. A noble woman was still her lord's property to discipline as he pleased behind chamber doors. Her wifely duty was to submit to his authority in all things. No matter the status, women were possessions first, their bodies and spirits subject to the whims of those who claimed dominion over them, their own voices muffled by the weight of power and tradition. Of course, the ultimate violation was marital rape, a concept that didn't even exist in the medieval mindset. Since marriage was primarily a way for men to produce legitimate heirs, a husband had an unfettered right to sexual access to his wife's body. Her willing participation was seen as irrelevant. Imagine the horror of having your body claimed as property, your consent erased, your suffering invisible in the eyes of law and society alike. These attitudes were only reinforced by religious doctrine and the era's rudimentary medical knowledge. Church teachings portrayed women as inherently sinful, lustful creatures who needed to be kept firmly under male control. Female desire was seen as an abnormality, whereas male desire was natural and unavoidable. The cruel irony of a faith that preached compassion yet justified control, casting women as dangerous temptresses in need of subjugation while excusing male aggression as divine right. If a husband forced himself on his wife, it was perhaps thought that her own wanting behavior had triggered his base urges. Medical texts, meanwhile, claimed that female seed had to be warmed. Women were stimulated to procreation by the vigorous action of the male rod. Women's enjoyment was considered essential to conception. By this logic, if a wife became pregnant, surely she must have been a willing participant in the act, regardless of her objections. Caught in the cruel web of victim blaming and tangled biological misunderstandings, women who suffered sexual violence found themselves utterly powerless. To speak out was to invite scorn, skepticism, and damning accusations. She wanted it, she tempted him into sin. The medieval Rupling poem chillingly advised, "What you can't prevent, you might as well enjoy." Such callousness stripped women of any voice or refuge. In the face of assault, a woman's best hope was often to avoid pregnancy and the additional shame that would follow. Midwives and healers, the quiet custodians of forbidden knowledge, passed down secret recipes for herbal abortifacients and contraceptives. Pennyroyal, tansy, and certain fungi could induce miscarriage. Rue, Queen Anne's lace, and wild carrot seed worked to prevent conception. These whispered remedies formed discreet networks of women resisting the tyranny imposed on their bodies. Yet even these small acts of rebellion carried grave risks: hemorrhage, infection, and worse, accusations of witchcraft. The medieval mind could not fathom women holding any control over their own reproductive destinies. Any attempt to subvert a husband's authority or defy what was deemed a God-given pregnancy was branded as the devil's work. Perhaps most heartbreakingly, some women internalized this oppression, coming to believe they deserved no better than the abuses heaped upon them. When marriage was a woman's sole option and her husband her lord and master, what choice remained but submission? How else could she imagine a life? And yet, despite the trauma inflicted on both body and soul, medieval women endured. They tended to each other's wounds with tenderness, whispered words of solidarity in the dark, and in quiet moments wove lives that transcended their suffering. Through sheer grit and quiet courage, they carried on, being beautiful wives, loving mothers, and keepers of self in a world that granted them precious little. Continuing this time-worn tradition of female resilience was an English mystic who rose to become one of the most influential Christian theologians of her age. Yet her cloistered existence began not entirely by choice, but as a last desperate refuge for an unmarriageable woman. Born in 1343, the woman history knows as Julian of Norwich was likely a surplus daughter in a noble family fallen on hard times. With no dowry or influential connections, her options would have been bleak. A burdensome spinster dependent on begrudging relatives or a life of back-breaking farm labor. For such undesirable women, the convent offered both refuge and a veneer of respectability. Thus, in her early 30s, Julian committed herself to one of the most extreme forms of religious life, that of an anchoress. Literally walled up in a small cell attached to the side of a church, she would spend the rest of her days in prayer and contemplation, never emerging into the light of day. The requisite ceremony carried all the gravity of a funeral mass, and understandably so. An anchoress bade a permanent farewell to the world of the living. The bishop would sprinkle the tomb of her cell with dust and intone, "Ashes to ashes, dust to dust." With the final bricking of the cell door, she was considered dead to all she previously knew, entering her tomb while still very much alive. Julian likely felt a mixture of terror and relief. By the grace of God, she had escaped the trials of marriage and motherhood that consumed and destroyed so many women. Yet she had condemned herself to a kind of living death, trapped in a stone prison scarcely large enough to lie down in. Still, for the pious Julian, even this harsh existence must have seemed preferable to being some man's cattle. An anchoress enjoyed a degree of autonomy almost unthinkable for a medieval woman. Subsisting on alms left by the faithful, she was beholden to no husband or father. Her days were her own to spend in solitary devotion to her heavenly spouse. Moreover, in a society that regarded most women's words as worthless prattle, an anchoress's pronouncements carried rare spiritual authority. Townsfolk would flock to the small curtained opening in Julian's cell to pour out their sins and troubles, hoping to receive divine wisdom from the holy woman's lips. And dispense wisdom Julian did, though of a surprisingly progressive bent for her time. In 1373, she experienced a series of vivid visions during a near-fatal illness. These mystical showings radically upended traditional Christian teachings about sin, damnation, and a wrathful God. Her visions centered on Jesus' Mother Mary and the motherhood of God. Julian saw the divine as a nurturing parent who cherished all creation and could never condemn any beloved child to eternal hellfire. Imagine the solitude, the profound silence and confinement that defined Julian's days and nights, the absence of human touch, the world outside reduced to a whisper beyond the stone walls. Yet within this stillness, her mind soared, exploring mysteries that would challenge centuries of dogma. Her visions must have ignited in her a fierce flame of hope, a radical reimagining of divine love that embraced mercy over wrath. In a time when women were silenced and marginalized, Julian's voice became a beacon of spiritual compassion and courage. She transformed her prison into a sanctuary of radical empathy, revealing a God whose love was not punitive but tender and boundless. Through her, the Divine Mother spoke, not as a distant judge but as a compassionate presence, cradling all creation. Julian's life stands as a testament to resilience, faith, and the power of a single woman's insight to ripple through history, offering light in even the darkest of ages. God is our mother as truly as he is our father, she proclaimed. In our mother, Jesus, we grow, and develop in mercy, he reforms and restores us. This tender maternal theology stood in stark contrast to the harsh patriarchal view of women as wicked temptresses and solid vessels of sin. For Julian, it was men's pride and reckless buying of love that marred God's perfect handiwork. Women like Mother Mary embodied the purest form of Christ-like love and mercy. When Julian recorded her subversive insights in Revelations of Divine Love, she became the first woman to write a book in the English language. Despite her physical confines, her radical compassion seeped out to permeate the popular religious imagination. Decades after her walled entombment, local people still referred to her as Dame Julian, who was living at Norwich. Indeed, though Julian's body remained immured in her anchor hold, her mind and soul roamed free within her cell. She created an interior world of meaning and beauty that defied the brutality without. For her and many solitary female mystics, the convent was both a refuge and a rare opportunity for intellectual and spiritual self-realization. Still, Julian's unlikely triumph cannot negate the tragedy of medieval women's overall plight. That a lifetime of walled solitude was one of their better options speaks to the soul-crushing limitations they faced. The vast majority never escaped the domestic prisons that constrained them from cradle to grave. Yet, lying here in the dark, listening to their softly unspooling stories, perhaps we can extend them the same mercy Julian saw in the mother heart of God. We can honor their suffering, resilience, and indomitable will to endure and find meaning despite it all. despite it all. In so doing, we strive to create a world where no woman need choose between a physical or mental tomb to know her own worth. But again, the Church offered one surprising path forward for some women pursuing a life devoted to faith. For a select few, joining a convent provided an alternative to marriage and motherhood, a chance to gain influence and exercise their minds. One remarkable woman who took this path was Hildegard of Bingen. Born in 1098 to a noble family in the Rhineland, as the 10th child, she was tithed to the Church and sent to live in a monastery at the tender age of 8. Rather than being oppressed by this cloistered life, Hildegard flourished. She experienced mystical visions from a young age, which she documented in vivid theological writings. Her musical compositions were groundbreaking, from stirring hymns to the first known morality play set to music. As an adult, Hildegard went on to found her own abbey. Her remarkable journey took her far beyond the cloistered walls. She gained widespread fame as a prophet and intellectual across Europe. Popes, emperors, and kings sought her spiritual insights and advice, recognizing a wisdom that transcended ordinary bounds. Her expertise spanned religion, science, medicine, and philosophy, fields few women of her time could even approach. She used her knowledge of herbal remedies to treat sick nuns and local villagers, healing not only bodies but spirits. While Hildegard's brilliance was exceptional, her story illuminates a larger truth. Monastic life offered an oasis of learning and culture for women. Behind abbey walls, nuns could devote themselves to scholarly pursuits that were off limits to their married peers. They spent their days in prayer, meditation, tending gardens, and producing incredible works of art and literature. The copying of manuscripts and illumination of sacred texts were common tasks. Within the sanctuary of the convent, their minds were free to wander, to create, to grow, unfettered by the demands that bound women in the outside world. Yet this freedom came with profound sacrifice. Nuns took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, surrendering earthly pleasures and attachments. Their lives were governed by strict routines of prayer and labor, and ultimately they remained under the authority of male religious leaders. Still, for women with a sincere spiritual calling, the convent was a refuge from the trials of the outside world, a place where their souls could breathe and their intellects could flourish. Another famous religious woman of the era was Catherine of Siena, born in 1347 to a large working-class family in Italy. From early childhood, Catherine was deeply devout, resisting her parents' attempts to arrange a marriage that would benefit the family. She took vows as a Dominican tertiary or lay member of the order at age 18 and committed herself to a life of prayer, fasting, and service to the sick and poor. Like Hildegard, Catherine experienced mystical visions of Christ and was regarded as a living saint. Yet she was also unafraid to speak truth to power. Through her passionate letters, she lambasted clergy for corruption and tirelessly pushed for reform within the church. When the Pope fled Rome for Avignon due to political conflict, Catherine traveled to France. She persuaded him to return to the Holy City, standing firm amid the turmoil of the Great Schism that rent Christendom apart with competing papal claimants. Catherine devoted herself tirelessly to the cause of restoring unity, pouring every ounce of strength and spirit into healing a fractured church. Her spiritual memoir, The Dialogue, was revolutionary, offering intimate, heartfelt conversations with God at a time when the church claimed to be the sole bridge between the divine and humanity. This bold personal theology broke new ground, inviting others to glimpse a direct, soulful connection to the sacred. But the cost was immense. Exhausted by relentless efforts and extreme ascetic practices, Catherine's fragile body gave way at just 33 years old. Though physically ravaged, her soul found profound peace, a testament to a life wholly surrendered to faith and purpose. Women like Hildegard of Bingen and Catherine of Siena embodied a remarkable possibility, intellectual and spiritual greatness even within the harsh limits of their society. They poured their faith into purposeful lives that transcended rigid conventions, becoming radiant examples of strength, wisdom, and devotion. Yet for most medieval women, such influence was unimaginable. The presence of these extraordinary monastic scholars and mystics introduced nuance and complexity to the era's gender dynamics, revealing glimpses of female power where it was least expected. For the vast majority, however, The church was less a source of elevation and more an instrument of control. Parish priests and nuns enforced strict moral codes, especially governing sexuality and propriety. Women's behavior was closely monitored. They were expected to be obedient, chaste, and compliant, their freedoms curtailed by the weight of rigid expectations. This dual reality of transcendent possibility and harsh repression defined the female experience in medieval Christendom, a world where faith was both a refuge and a constraint. To conclude everything we've explored, the stories of medieval women are not just history. They are a powerful reminder of strength, resilience, and courage in the face of adversity. Through every page of their lives, they endured unimaginable challenges, and it is because of their sacrifices that we continue to fight today for the freedom and dignity of every woman. Are you satisfied with the insights and stories shared here? Please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a comment, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel so you won't miss more valuable content. Wishing you a good night, sweet dreams, and peaceful rest.